Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Easy Conversations podcast, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dandia. In this week's episode, I sit down with Dan McMillan, who is the director of Assured Psychology based here in Calgary. Dan and I talk about the importance of working with men and how to encourage vulnerability. Dan shares his experience of working with men and the changes he has seen over the years and the changes he hopes to continue to influence to support the growth of men. I really hope you can get a lot out of this episode, and if at the end you could leave a 5-star review, I would truly appreciate it. All right, Dan, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you taking the time and super grateful to have you on here and for us to have this conversation. And, I'm again grateful that you reached out and we were able to connect and do this. I enjoy having people like yourself on here and having these conversations. But before we get started and get into the discussion we want to have today, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and some of the work you're doing before we get into some of the things we want to cover today.
Sure. Sure. Thanks for having me on. My name is Daniel McMillan, or Dan. I don't really care which. My mother still calls me Daniel, and everyone else calls me Dan. So I'm the director of Assured Psychology, which is a psychology firm in Calgary, and we have an office in Cochrane. And I'm a psychologist as well, a registered psychologist in the province of Alberta. I'm not sure how far to go down that road or what else to tell you about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, how long have you been in the field? And, especially, probably two questions here in the role of the director, and then how long have you been a psychologist?
Sure. I've been a therapist for about, what year is it? For about 17 years now, but I wasn't always a psychologist. I started out working in the schools up north, and then I was an addiction counselor with youth, teens. I went back to grad school and got my degree, and then became a provisional psychologist and a registered psychologist. So I've been doing therapy about 17 years. I've been a psychologist. That's a good question. About, I want to say about 8 now. I should know. It's about 8.
Well, the last couple of years have been blurry for everyone. So
yeah, 2014, I think. So maybe about 7 or 8, I think, as a registered first provisional registered psychologist. And I worked for Alberta Health Services, the public health body, as you know, here in Alberta for quite a long time, about 15 of those years. And I started my practice on the side years ago. My first daughter, it was like 3 days after the mat leave came up, and my partner went back to work. And then she got laid off on day 2. And so I started a practice on the side just to kind of buffer that. And I'd always wanted to. And then it slowly grew and became my main job, and then was going well and just sort of expanded into a team. And we've been a group practice for about 2 years now, not that long. We're still young and growing. There's about 7 therapists on our team. Yeah.
Cool.
It's been super rewarding, honestly. Like, I consider myself incredibly fortunate. I get paid. I get a career out of essentially personal growth. Is the offshoot of it. So It's pretty incredible. And in my high school yearbook, I wrote that I wanted to be a psychologist. So it kind of that, or a park warden. So it worked out.
Yeah, no, that's pretty amazing that you were able to kind of identify back in high school what you wanted to do. I know I struggled quite a bit. I'm nowhere near what I thought I would be, but for the better. But yeah, no, that's amazing. And I guess, you and I connected over Instagram, and one of the things we chatted about was men's mental health and some of the work you're doing. But before we explore that, like, I wanted to understand what's your motivation, what inspires you to kind of focus in that space, and considering there's been all this additional focus recently on men's mental health. There's been a lot of discussion about it, and most of the people I've connected with or have had on my podcast, we've talked about suicide rates being high amongst men, and then the whole stigma around men not being able to express themselves or show vulnerability. But I wanted to get your perspective on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big question. So I might ramble, so hopefully you can keep me contained.
Yeah.
I mean, there's sort of two, I think, if I think out loud, I think there's two answers, and I'll try to move through them both. The professional answer is, when I was in the public system, I saw the percentage, the regular percentage, which is the large majority of people that access counseling or mental health support are women. So I probably saw about 75% women, 25% men. And then when I moved into private practice, I mean, I didn't even plan it, but my caseload just became reverse. It became 75% plus men, especially at first. And it wasn't my doing. They self-selected me. And I started, I'm a man, and I identify as one. So it's always been something close to the heart, obviously. But I started noticing very consistent themes. I would say in all people, but a fairly consistent and unique presentation in men. And this is sort of why I said it's a big question. I don't know how far to go here, but there's some innate ways that we're built to operate as human beings that have been helping us cope on this planet for a very, very long time, way before our cultural ideas of independence or manly or feminine. And some of those seem to be at odds with our ideas of what it is to be a man.
Yeah.
And we don't really have much in the way of role models of otherwise. So specifically what I mean by that is I noticed a few things. The first is all human beings have 6 innate emotions. And I mean, the literature sometimes splits up those 6 and divides. So it ranges, but depending, what source you quote, but most people believe in 6, sometimes 7 innate human emotions, including sadness, fear, shame, core anger, which is different from secondary, joy, surprise, that's not as big of one. And there's a real problem if you take an innate energy, an innate source that has an evolutionary purpose, and you tell one half of the population they don't get it. Like I picture walking through like a nursery of babies and telling all the male babies, you got to be angry, but you're not allowed to be scared or sad or feel shame. You keep that to yourself. And then telling all the female babies, you're not allowed to be angry. Like you gotta hide that. Like the devastation that causes. And then, we exist in relationship. We're relational beings. And so that's where we learn these lessons, but that's also where we replicate these lessons. And so that's the other thing I noticed. It's just these brutal relationships men were having, both in their marriages and their partnerships, and with each other. And they're all based off of these, really terrible ideas, these hierarchical ideas, ideas where men feel they have to wear masks and can't really be themselves. They hide their pain. They're not allowed the pain. And so, of course, it comes out through harm and often harm to others. And men, especially white men, are a privileged group. So what happens if you take a privileged group, tell them to hide their pain and give them a bunch of power? They do a lot of harm, which I know is some men listening might not like that. I mean, we can be pretty defensive over that idea. But I think even that defensiveness comes from the idea that no one can see your pain or you're not allowed to hurt because you have privilege. And so I just started noticing, really depressed men, really lonely men. Most of them didn't have any friends, especially if they'd been moving around geographically. Really successful men that had put all their idea of worth and value into achievement. And then they get everything they could dream and reach the top of the pile and retire. And they're terribly depressed and terribly lonely and have no idea who they are without that. So I just started noticing these themes around emotional restriction, and that sounds cold, around not being allowed to be fully human, around not being able to show up in relationships vulnerably, and around their own worth being attached to something, and usually around achievement or success or comparison to other men versus the truth, which is we have all the exact same amount of worth. It's not conditional.
Right.
And no one seems to have taught that. So I started noticing when I set up a shingle, a massive amount of very successful men showing up like that.
Yeah.
And it made me want to start a group. So I started trying to get all these men into a group. And, I know you've had a few guests who have successfully done this, especially internationally. But at that time, and probably because it was just me, and I had 2 jobs and young kids, it didn't end up running. But I noticed so often that they didn't have friends, and they were saying the exact same thing, that it would be so nice to put them together in a group. And now I have this idea I want to run of called Man Camp after
Yeah.
COVID kind of gets solved. I want to do a weekend retreat called Man Camp, where we actually talk about how you can be a man but have sadness, or be a man and show up vulnerably in a relationship, and how that actually looks. But I think it'd be cool to do it in a wilderness space, kind of like,
Yeah. Away from everything, but get back into
yeah,
nature.
yeah, and a lot of coming of age of becoming a man for a long time in many cultures, like the first hunt,
Yeah.
like had a wilderness based element. Um, so I think there's something elemental in that. I feel like now I am rambling. So
No, and I think you touched on a couple of things that I wanted to dig a bit deeper into. So I think part of it is, you mentioned that a lot of these men, like the common theme was they didn't feel like they had friends, and I think personally I've been there too, where you feel lonely, and it's not so much that you don't have friends. In my personal experience, it's more so I'm not comfortable talking about these emotions or fears or insecurities with my friends.
yeah, there's an
And then you
invisible
kind of
wall.
isolate yourself. You like you said, you put on this mask around your friends, and then you want to be able to express all these things, but you just don't want to seem weak or insecure in front of your friends, so then you do feel like you don't have friends.
Yeah, I so I grew up probably like a lot of your listeners, which is fairly traditional. I grew up in the country in Alberta with a lot of brothers and playing contact sports and all that stuff. And I never ever got a lesson of how to show up in a male relationship that was authentic and
Mm-hmm.
anything other than fun and the joyful parts. Which is really interesting because when men drink together, they often are very affectionate to each other, right? They say, I love you, and they put their
Yeah.
arms around each other. Um, so I can identify with that. And then later in my life, when I started to go through some hard things, I remember looking at my group of friends, and I have a good group of male friends, and thinking, I can't talk to any of them about what I'm going through. And I
Mm-hmm.
had to make this intentional choice for myself and I thought I can either find new friends, which I don't, I'm going to be starting over and I don't think that's going to solve this problem, or I can change these friendships. And I felt like I had to stubbornly nudge the edges. This is how I think of it, nudging the edges of the vulnerability in those relationships again and again. But I had to it took a lot of courage to bravely tell them. At that point, we'd lost a pregnancy at 6 months, to bravely tell my male friends about that and to let them see my tears, let them hear in my voice my pain. And they showed up, like, guys which we never talked about anything. They showed up, and I was relieved. I was also surprised.
Yeah.
So I can really identify with that. I feel like this invisible rule is that we all keep it together and keep it funny.
Yeah.
But when life's not funny, that it's incredibly lonely. And that's the theme I'd see in my office is again, men would just tell me they're alone.
Yeah, and it, I kind of feel the same way, like over the last few years for me too, just going through separation, divorce, stuff like that. I've had to start speaking about it, because some days it would just get tough, and being able to like talk to my friends about it has helped, to the point where now we almost have like this sense of community where, if anyone's going through a tough time, we're able to pull on each other and have the difficult conversations and talk about some of the deeper stuff that, maybe 10 years ago we wouldn't have been able to express, or we would have been too afraid to talk about. And then there's the occasional friend here and there who's just really uncomfortable, and that's they're on their own journey. They're still figuring it out, and it has nothing to do, the way I look at it has nothing to do with me. It's just their level of comfort is not there. And they're not willing to go there or be vulnerable. And that's okay too, right? You can't shame that either. So it's being mindful of that. But I think it is so important to have that community of men, or like you said, even have a man camp where you can just connect, and have that brotherhood.
Yeah, I mean, I lost myself in that. I was thinking there, at one point in my career, I took teens, these addicted teens who are usually drug dealers or gang members. We go on backcountry trips. We do multi-day canoe trips or backcountry. And it was the most incredible thing. Like, a lot of these kids had never left the city. And to see them like on a 5-day canoe, like, it was incredible. And it was so life-changing. And so I really think all men could benefit from that. It's something you were saying, register, but I totally forgot what it was now. Oh, that's what I was just thinking about. In my journey, what I've noticed, interestingly, is as I've leaned into those moments of vulnerability more, the other side of me has shown up in a healthier, more balanced way. So what I mean, like the yin and yang, like what I mean by that is, as I've allowed myself more vulnerability, more tears, to name my sadness, to name fear, to share that, I've found that I feel more confident in also my masculinity on the other side. I at that time brought in jiu-jitsu into my life and Muay Thai a little bit, and these two seem to balance each other out, versus I felt like when I was more shut off emotionally to my own vulnerability, trying to just be stoically the right type of man. I mean, I played rugby or a few other things, but it didn't ever feel secure. It always felt like I was like an imposter.
Yeah.
I wasn't really a quote unquote man.
Yeah.
So I've found that really incredibly rewarding in the last few years. Is the more I've been able to lean into my own, yin or yang, whichever side the more feminine is, the more my masculine side has shown up in a very peaceful way. I don't feel I have to prove anything.
Yeah, and I think it feels authentic, right? Like, whereas where you're trying to mask the emotions, you're compensating to have this image of a man, but it doesn't feel right. So obviously, like you said, you feel like an imposter, and there's no confidence when you're faking it, right? And I think until you don't accept who you are and the way you show up, it does appear inauthentic, and that's where the confidence isn't there, right? And everyone sees it.
Yeah, and I also think it perpetuates it, because it almost always creates a bit of a hierarchy. You're comparing yourself versus others, which they feel, and either you're putting them below you, which is terrible for them, or above you, which is terrible for you. Like, there's no win in that scenario.
Yeah.
I think they feel it, and then they posture, and we're just a bunch of roosters walking with their chest puffed out at that point. Like, yeah. I had meant to say, when I said there was two things earlier, and then I kind of distracted myself, was the other piece I think that fits into all this for me is that I learned this lesson, like most of us, very young. And I remember being quite young and getting sick a lot, and not really ever there being an explanation. They couldn't figure out why. They kept taking blood. They kept doing all this stuff. And looking back now, and my father was a physician, so I'm pretty sure we would have figured it out if there was an answer. The answer they always kept come up with is like, there's no answer. And I wasn't terribly, terribly sick. I could still function. But looking back, I really think it was just at a hard time in my life. I was following this map. I just kept everything in, and I was really good at keeping everything in. I come from a big family. I was probably one of the best in the family at that. I used to get a lot of compliments for it. I remember at someone close to me at their funeral, people complimenting me and not crying. I know I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but I didn't want to leave that piece out, because that felt like a foreign piece and relevant to this.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's like, and I talk to people about it too. When you store, in this case, not necessarily stress, but you're holding your emotions back. But even when you hold stress back or other forms of emotions internally, it shows up in different ways. And I guess in your case, it was showing up as sickness as a child. And it has to come out somehow.
Yeah, I mean, we have emotions for reasons, for important reasons. They are evolutionarily useful, and relationally useful. So when you hold them in, they damage a lot of things, but your nervous system doesn't do well with that. Your nervous system impacts your immune system and impacts your heartbeat. So I think I mean, this dual model of medicine is that the brain is one thing, your body's another, that's crazy. It's like saying, well, if your kidney's sick and you have a rash in your arm, there's no way they could be related. Like, no, your brain is just a massive organ of your body. It's just a really powerful one.
For sure.
I'm losing myself again. I totally forgot. I'm sorry. I lost my train of thought.
I think with the brain, though, I mean, and I've talked to people quite a bit about it on the podcast or even, just offline, but the brain's job is to protect us and take care of us, right? And that's where your defense mechanisms come in. And I think that the function is to protect the body, protect us, but it can also cause a lot of harm, right? Because with the defense mechanisms, you end up responding to things inappropriately, and you consider things a threat, and the fight or flight mechanism kicks in. But it's important to be mindful of that too.
I think there's some cool stuff there. All of our defenses are incredibly useful. So at some point in our life, they were the best choice. They're just not as useful now, which is a different kind of way to think about it. And so I think our brain is an incredible survival mechanism, and it just preferences survival. So if something helped you, and since we're attachment beings, since we're packed animals, anything that helped you feel accepted and loved and safe in your family is a survival mechanism. And if that mechanism is, being stoic, that is a deeply learned lesson, and your brain's going to hold on to that. Yeah, like I think it's pretty neat, but I think it's important that our defenses are bad. Just like our Navy, our Army, all that stuff's not bad.
Yeah.
It'd be bad if it started attacking our own country. That wouldn't be so great, or picking fights with countries when it doesn't need to.
Yeah, and that's important. Like you said, I mean, the defense mechanisms were there to serve a purpose, but then when it lingers into your adult life, which happens to a lot of people, myself included, it's being able to identify what the source was, why is it there now, and being able to like separate yourself from it. And I've talked about it quite a bit, but I've had to do a lot of work over the years, going to see my psychologist and sitting down and talking about and digging really deep in terms of where the trauma came in from and why I had these defenses throughout my life and how they continue to show up in my relationships. But just being mindful of it allows you to make a change, and forgiving yourself, right?
Yeah, I think you're touching on three really important points of that. Being mindful, the noticing, the cognizant is, I think, very important, but I think you touched on two very important points that don't get as much attention. One of them is essentially you have to feel the pain sooner or later. You have to go into it. You said doing the work. Yeah, I mean, at some point, like there's no way around but through. Like at some point, you have to face the thing that drives these defenses, or you'll keep replicating them. I don't believe insight is sufficient. It's good, but it's not sufficient. And then you said, forgive yourself, which is self-compassion, is to have some compassion that the reason you do these things that you are so annoyed at yourself for doing the next day, that they actually came from a place of pain. And it might be what I call car crash pain, which is a clear injury. So you broke your femur in a car crash, or you have a clear thing that happened to you that was really devastating and hard. But I also think there's the lead paint of our lives, which is the thing we breathe in and ingest every day without really knowing it, and we sort of adjust to it sort of, but then we get sick and don't really know why. And even the impact of a car crash would be determined by the lead paint in your body. And I think that's the pain that we don't culturally really have a good grasp on. I think that's the pain of podcasts like this and talking about men. What they're trying to begin to combat is the pain of the silence, and of the mask. But I really like that you said all 3 points. Sometimes I feel like there's a great emphasis on the knowing, the recognizing, and stepping away from. But if you've ever met anyone that has an addiction that sees it's an addiction, it's not so easy just to stop a behavior that is doing something for you. So I think that's such an important note for your listeners, is that it's sort of like we have to learn at some point to turn and walk into the building that we think is on fire, which is what it feels like. Afterwards, you get wisdom and beauty and all these wonderful things from it, deepening. And so I'm actually really glad to hear you say that and not just simplify it down to that you just have to know it and stop doing it.
Well, no, and I think knowing it and not doing something about it is also a form of defense mechanism, because you're being avoidant, right? So you're afraid.
And what if you?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go. Sorry, I was just gonna say, what if you can't? What if you can't? Like if it's self-serving, if the behavior is self-serving, if I drink, every moment I can to numb my trauma, to just tell me not to drink is not a sufficient answer, because it's actually keeping me from the overwhelming pain of my trauma. I need to help dealing with my trauma if I'm going to stop drinking, in this example.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I think it, and that's the thing, like the hardest part is stepping away from that self-serving behavior, because now you're getting out of your comfort zone, because the behaviors or the maladaptive behaviors you've been engaging in have been serving a purpose. They feel safe, they feel comfortable, and until you don't actually step away and get out of your comfort zone, that's you're going to stay in that loop, and people do, right? And it's unfortunate. But I think for me personally, the other thing I like to remind people is, even once I've done the work on, say, one situation from childhood, perhaps, something else comes up, and it's like, okay, now what's going on here? And it's going back for therapy and digging into it again, and then it's discovering another incident that happened where, again, it was something traumatic or something difficult, and I responded with a defense mechanism, and then it's just become a habit over the years, right? So it is a continuous cycle, and you have to keep going at it.
But I think that's the cool part of being human. It'd be pretty boring if you hit 48 and all of a sudden, or 58 or whatever, all of a sudden, okay, I figured it all out. I think that, and the lessons always come from our pain. So at first the pain is so unbearable and it creates so much symptoms. And so I'm not trying to make lemonade out of lemons by any means, but it is this incredible thing about being human, that once we sort of deal with the symptoms and sort of cauterize the wound, that we have a chance to use our pain to deepen into ourselves forever. There's no end point on that. Mm-hmm. And the same for relationships. Conflict is not the best determinant of a relationship success. It's actually repair, because conflict's inevitable. But to be able to use it as a chance to, say to your partner, this is what was going on for me. When you did that, it made me feel this way and reminded me of this, and I deeply, needed this. I think that's actually a spiritual thing about being human. It's incredible. We can live our whole lives deepening into who we are, and the pain is the gateway.
Sure. Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. And like you said, a conflict in a relationship, it's an opportunity to learn something, and it's all about your mindset, right?
It's an opportunity to get closer.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and it's all about your mindset. You can look at it as a negative thing, whether it's something personal or something that happens in your relationship, whether it's conflict or it's all about your mindset. And one of the most amazing things I heard recently, Will Smith was on the Jay Shetty podcast, and he said the second we start looking at life as a classroom and not as serving pleasure, everything changes, because you need to realize that your life is always teaching you something. It's not, you're not in this world to like constantly get pleasure. It's about learning something. And the second you recognize that and you shift your mindset, you perceive even the most difficult situations, you look for an opportunity to get something out of it.
Yeah, I think in my mind, the question is what allows us to do that? To, why in our own lives do we, at some points, is so hard to take failure, to take struggles as a learning, and why in other times can we be so open to it? I'm not speaking hypothetically. I'm literally trying to think of the answer to myself. I can think of the answer to others, but I want it to be authentic. For me, it so much comes down to attachment or to relationships. I think in moments, either like presently or historically, I can feel loved. I can call upon that sense of like, there's people that have my back. I'm not alone in this world.
Mm-hmm.
I can tolerate the hard lessons and the failure and say, okay, I'm not perfect, but this or that. But at times when I can't, I think are the times when I feel pretty alone, which goes back to what we were saying, that our pain, our sadness, our fear is actually the thing that connects us. So if you're not allowed to share that, if you're a man, so you're not allowed to share that, that means you're going to feel pretty alone, which means it's going to be pretty hard to, in my mind, pretty hard to tolerate threats to your sense of self. And become hyperactive. Because I and the reason I say all this is because I see a lot of this on YouTube and stuff. A lot of men, especially, we value, like the Navy SEAL that tells you just gotta go, like just think positive, get through the pain, and I mean all that. I love that stuff growing up. But I think there's a reason that we think the way we do in moments. And I think it's really important to honor that context.
Yeah, and I think for me, the other so again, going back to the talking about being alone, I feel like sometimes I choose that for myself, because it's not so much that I've gotten past the point of where being afraid of looking like I'm weak. I'm past that. I'm like, okay, you know what? That's not an issue for me. The issue now that I struggle with, in terms of not being able to talk about whatever I'm going through or whatever I'm struggling with, is I don't want to burden people with it.
Yeah.
And that's another, I think another,
layer
hurdle I need to get over, because it prevents me from expressing myself. Because I'm like, if I constantly talk about what's bothering me, my friends are gonna be like, well, this guy's always complaining, right? Or it's just like, oh, here's another issue, right? So that's another thing I need to get my head around.
I mean, that's a word I think almost every person that sits in my office uses. And so I started thinking about the last few years, this idea that most of us have, which is that if we share, we'll burden others. And I don't mean this to be in any way critical, but here's what I've realized, because I've also think that. And even now I know this intellectually, but if I have a good cry and lean on someone's shoulder, afterwards, I often will need reassurance that I'm not didn't somehow do great harm to them. Which is always the opposite. Human beings, we like to be needed. We like to see people authentically. I mean, that's what makes a good movie for us is, we feel it. It's a gift. And we do that for others. If I told you, oh, your friends burden you a lot, you'd say, no, never. Your son burdens you, never.
Yeah.
But yet for ourselves, I think often this is a fear. And my thinking now is that the idea of burden is actually just this sneaky little guise for the fear to be, one of the many fears to be vulnerable. And the guise is that I won't be accepted if I show up in my quote unquote weakness. And so if I say it's for you guys, I'm not going to burden you, or I'm constantly, which of course you're not constantly doing anything, then I should put the reins on this. So I encourage people to think of it as a fear, like a block, rather than than a truth that, yeah, I'm just too much. I think we all have a fear of being too much if we show up with the kind of our pain. And some points in our life, the pain is a lot, some points not a lot. But I've been thinking a lot about this the last while, and I'm sure there's more there, but that's my thinking so far. Is it's just a clever way of actually saying, I'm really scared that I'm going to be too much for you and you'll reject me. And that will be devastating in my vulnerability. That'll be devastating for me because I really need you in that moment. So I'd rather tell myself, nope, that's enough. You get a spoonful, but I can't trust you with more because I don't want you to tell me I'm too much. I don't know your thoughts on that for Ken, but.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you kind of nailed it for me because, I encourage my friends or even the men I work with. It's like, hey, just don't be ashamed. Just let it out.
Oh, wow.
And I won't judge you. I won't make you feel shamed. But, but when it comes to me, I'm just too afraid, like you said, it's like that fear of being too much, or just, again, going back to that concept of burdening someone. I think it's just like the way I see it, and I don't know if that would work for everyone, but just like, if you can create a community or kind of a safe space amongst your friends where you're open to talking about your struggles, like which I've created amongst my friends, the next step is being like, there's no, like, if there's nothing else going on, there's no emergency, I am available for you. And you kind of have that safe space as well, that, you can cry, you can talk about whatever's going on, and that's your safe space. And maybe taking it a step further and just putting it out there.
Yeah, there's so much there. Like that last piece, putting it out there, having to actually ask is so hard.
Yeah.
And or even just being honest, like when a buddy texts me, how are you doing? So hard not to just make a joke or,
Yeah.
It's fine, good, yeah. But to actually show up and be honest and say, not good today,
Mm-hmm.
or this is what's happening. Yeah, and I'm always, for me, I like to think myself of this as like the edge inside, the vulnerable edge inside, rather than, I think we are too linear and too binary, and I think this way too.
Mm-hmm.
I do that for a long time. That was my defense. I do that already. I'm the all-knowing psychologist in the relationship, so listen, I've got this covered. You're the broken one. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, nail vulnerability. I got that. So don't talk to me about vulnerability, which isn't true. We all need to defend. We all have a line inside of ourselves, an edge that we are feeling like we're a burden, or we're feeling too much or whatever. And so for me, I try to think when I'm being self-aware of like, where's that edge in this moment? And am I okay nudging it a little bit? Am I okay showing up authentically a little bit? And it's always worked like a lot. That's the cool thing, is we're never actually a burden.
Mm-hmm.
The other person might not know how to respond. And in our culture, there's a good chance that might dumbfound the man you're talking to, but he has mirror neurons. We all have mirror neurons, which is that when you actually show a core emotion and are vulnerable, it cues the same feeling in that other person. This is why they think one of the reasons we evolve so quickly is phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to see me, snap my finger back in pain, to know that that's a bad idea. You shouldn't do that. You see me do it, and you think, oh, you don't have to do it. I don't want to feel what he feels. It looks like a terrible idea.
Yeah.
But it's true for all of our core emotions. Sadness pulls, fear, pulls reassurance, shame. Shame only lives in the dark. And so that's the cruelty, is when we're only allowed to morph it to anger. Anger pushes away. And so that's the irony of this idea of burden, is when you actually show up authentically, it's actually a gift, because we love it when people do that for us. We love it when someone lets us in. Yeah. And they're the one actually giving us a gift. I think my clients gift me like all the time. I hopefully I can give something back, but when someone lets you into their real place, it's just, I think it's nourishing, because that's essentially what we're all striving for. We're striving for that true human connection that we were born as babies looking for to survive. I need you, show up for me. I feel tearful as I say, so I'm not 100% sure why, other than it's incredibly meaningful.
Yeah, no, I again, I agree with you 100%. Like, when my friends open up to me, I do feel honored, because they are sharing a part of themselves with me that I wouldn't normally see. And they're trusting me with their emotions and whatever they're going through. And that's hard to talk about, because we often judge ourselves, and we shame ourselves for whatever mistakes we've made or poor choices we've made. And to be able to openly speak about it not only empowers you, because now you're normalizing it, you're taking away that shame from it, but it also allows your friends to like be there for you and be supportive.
Yeah, I like what you said. You feel trusted when they do it, which is like you feel good about yourself. So it's this opposite of this idea of burden, but yet we all, including myself, can go there. It's so funny how we can know one thing. It's like that. I heard this somewhere, that the longest 12 inches is from your head to your heart. Knowing is one thing, but believing is another.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. And I guess to kind of end things off here, like, what are some of the things you've got on the go? So I'm excited about this man camp. I would totally love to be a part of it. But what else is going on, and how's like the work you're doing with men? Like, are you planning on doing other stuff, group work and all that kind of stuff? Hopefully once this COVID stuff is behind us.
Yeah, I have this my way of sort of putting intention beside something is I'll put it on our website and then I'm accountable to it.
Yeah.
So I put the man can on. It doesn't have dates, because I'm using COVID as a little bit of an excuse for that.
Yeah.
I put that on. I don't think I put the groups on, but I put that on. So I feel like I am as stretched as I can right now, just with my practice, with the group and the kids and everything. But I did put the man camp on there, so I do want to run that. It was hopefully going to be this summer, but I don't think there's a chance that's going to work now. So next summer, I was thinking like a 2 or 3 day, somewhere like Kananaskis or Benchlands, Water Valley, maybe Kenmore, like somewhere like that, where we do some group work, but also we blend coming together as guys, partly in the wilderness, partly talking about things like relationships, emotions, but not like talking about it as men, but actually talking about it. And but then bringing in some more classical, maybe we build fires, or maybe I don't know, maybe I bring in my jiu-jitsu coach, or I don't know, something like, maybe not that, the liability would be terrible on that, but I think that there is, so I take a lot of comfort out of how our culture's changed its view of fatherhood. So in the 50s, a good father was someone that provided and tapped his kids good night on the head, and that was, maybe I'm generalizing and it's probably not fair, but it was considered not manly to be a like caring, involved father. Like in some places, in some cultures, I don't want to generalize, but in many places in North America, that was considered the opposite. And now our culture has shifted on this, where I think it's incredible. The epitome of being a man right now as a father is both sides of yourself, is both discipline and being stern and being strong, and is gentleness and teaching and care, and I think that to me is very hopeful, because I think that's where masculinity needs to go on a larger level. We don't have, if you try to think of role models in our media for that, there's popular ones anyway, there's very few that embody both sides. And so my hope is I would love to create a weekend and then maybe a group after that where we as men can explore the balance of both sides of ourselves as men, because you're both sad and a man. Sadness doesn't make you a woman,
Yeah.
or like it makes you human.
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't have much going on other than the normal practice, assured psychology or normal work, and hopefully a few groups like that or something down the pipe for I think next 2021, summer 2020. No, what years? Yes. No, this
2022.
year's 2022. Yes, summer 2022 would be cool. And me putting out there is, I think, my way of trying to be more accountable to
Yeah.
that too.
Well, it's your way of manifesting it too, right? Just putting it out there. But that sounds amazing. I think it's a great idea. And I think a lot of men who are listening locally can really benefit from it by taking part.
If anyone listens and thinks that would be really cool, shoot me an email at Assured Psychology. Just go to assuredpsychology.com, shoot an email to us, and I will put your name in a little folder or something that will also help me say, yes, I need it. Because I have it in my head.
Yeah.
I just need to actually translate it to action. So, yeah.
No, that's great. And that's kind of what was my next question. So that's perfect plug. If people do want to get a hold of you, what are other forms other than going to the website, but other forms of getting a hold of you?
Sure. We have our social media accounts with Assured Psychology. And I have actually a second website and a second account called Calgary Couples, which is just a branch of Assured Psychology. But relationships are the best predictor of your happiness. So we thought they're pretty important and deserve their own thing. Yeah, I think that's the best way. Usually the website's the best way. I don't think we have any other ways in, tools in.
Yeah, I mean, social media is kind of the mainstay nowadays. So that's
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what our social media accounts are. I'm terrible at that. It's _Calgary_couples or just Assured Psychology, Assured Psychology. I think on Instagram and Facebook. Yeah.
okay. Great.
Yeah.
And again, Dan, I want to thank you for coming on here, having this conversation with me. I think we were able to touch on a lot of things and it was great to get your perspective on it and some of the things you've seen with clients. I think it's really important to get that other side of the kind of lens because we typically talk about it from like the perspective of seeking help, but often we don't hear about what it is to be on the other end. So I think that's really important that you were able to talk about that. But again, it's amazing the work you're doing, and I wish you the best with some of the group work you want to initiate. And I think it'll be amazing and really valuable for some of the men here in Calgary.
Yeah, thank you again. I really appreciate what you're doing. I started listening to your podcast in preparation of this, and I think I'll keep listening. I like it. I like what you're doing, and I've already learned about a lot of things across the world. A lot of the men are doing, which I think is fantastic. We need more voices out there, kind of helping us, guide us, like set a path towards what it means to be a healthy, wholehearted man. So I think that's awesome.
Yeah, no, thank you for the support. I always appreciate that. So, well, that's the end of the episode. Thank you again for tuning in. As always, please leave a 5-star review. And until next week.